Hey CSU, Liam here with our next weekly video. We don't have an interview this week, we've got one next week, and I promise you next week is a doozy. But we're continuing our series on Jesus. Last week we had Sally Douglas, and we were talking about Jesus and how understanding Jesus as the female divine might help us speak into situations of patriarchy. And now continuing this idea of how do we speak of Jesus responsibly, I want to talk about where we find the presence of Christ. Where do we locate Christ? How do we experience? Where do we find the presence? Because Christ will be with us always, we are told. Where is that presence found? Is it found in Scripture? In the stories of Jesus, the gospel narratives, or in Paul's words about Jesus? Is that where we encounter and discover the presence of Christ? Is it through continued church practices like liturgy? Through the communal reciting of these shared words, do we understand and encounter the presence of Christ there? Is it at the communion table, in the elements of the blood and the bread that are meant, the blood of the wine and the bread of the body, are we meant to encounter Christ's presence there? Or perhaps is it through worship, in singing songs of Jesus or about our praise of Jesus or our commitment to follow Jesus? Do we encounter the presence of Christ there? Or is it somewhere else, or is it a combination? I tend to lean toward combination, but I feel that often by focusing on some of those previous ways of understanding Jesus through just the Bible or just the communion table or just by hearing the word preached or through worship, that it can sometimes limit the practical effect, the practical outworking that the presence of Christ has on our life. It becomes a very internalized thing that I experience the presence of Christ for my own good alone. And I don't think that's what the presence of Christ is about. Jesus didn't come into the disciples' lives just to help them or to give them a feeling. It was to equip them and empower them to continue Christ's work after he was gone. So where might we find Christ's presence in a way that keeps us outward focused? That rather than looking up or just in, we are looking down and out. What might it be? Well, I think two passages give us clues for this. The first is Matthew 25. It's a famous passage of the sheep and the goats where Jesus separates the righteous and the unrighteous to his right and left. In this passage, Jesus says, "Come to me, the people who are righteous, because when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was sick, you visited me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was naked, you gave me clothes. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me." And the people who have been welcomed, these righteous people, are like, "Well, Jesus, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or sick or in prison?" And Jesus said, "For whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did unto me." And then it's reversed as well. We see that if for any time that we did not feed the hungry, that we did not visit the sick, that we did not care for the needy and the stranger, that we didn't do that for Jesus. That we didn't tend to Jesus and the call, and those people are sent away. So what seems to be happening in that passage is that these least, the least in our communities, are practically and very really embodying, in a special way embodying the presence of Christ. They come to represent Christ's presence in the community. And the people, the righteous, don't even know that's Christ. They're just caring for people. But in those acts, they encounter Christ. They encounter Christ's presence, and so their salvation is meted out through that experience. The second passage is Acts 9. It's Paul's conversion scene. Paul is going along the road to Damascus, and bam, a bright light hits him. Now what's important is what Paul was on his way to do. Saul was on his way to persecute Christians. A marginalised community, a community under pressure, whose leader had been killed by the political powers of the day, and these people are very vulnerable. And they've been persecuted violently. And Saul is part of that. And so when Saul is stopped, you may expect to hear something like, "Paul, what are you doing? You're persecuting these poor people." No, but the voice from the heavens, the voice of the risen Lord, of Jesus, says to Paul, "Paul, why are you persecuting me?" Again, there is this kind of transference, this kind of representation where the least of these, the community of Christ, this marginalized, disenfranchised, violated, and exploited community, is representing Jesus. The presence of Christ is found in the least, and in the victimized, those who suffer marginalization, who suffer violent persecution, who suffer disenfranchisement, who are hungry and thirsty, who are in prison, who are sick. These are the people who come to represent the presence of Christ. And so what's the implication for us? Well, there's twofold. There is clearly an implication that we need to be caring for these people whether or not they have any representation of Christ, because clearly in Matthew 25, they were just caring for people and they were deemed righteous for doing so. But more so for us in this moment, it's important to recognize that this is one of the key places we can find the presence of Christ. And what's important is this is a way of finding the presence of Christ which takes us out of our pews, out of our buildings, out of our churches, out of our comfortability and into the presence of others. It tells us to go and look for those who are least in our community, those who are exploited and marginalized. Look for those who are being left out. Look for those who need help and material provision and support them. And in so doing, we encounter Christ. And this is another important twist of this, is that it grants agency. So often we think of maybe the refugees or Indigenous Australians or the poor in our community or the lonely in our community as people who just need our help. As people we need to be able to help out, as a recipients of our charity. But this understanding where these people are Christified, basically they come to represent in some special way the presence of Christ, come to embody the continued incarnation of Jesus. When these people undergo that, when these people are recognized as the presence of Christ, then they are not solely recipients of our charity, but they gain agency in that they come to represent both Christ's salvation, Christ's revelation, and Christ's sanctification of us. By encountering Christ in the least of these, by experiencing the presence of Jesus in our service of those in need, we are shaken from our apathy. We are formed into better disciples of Christ. And we are, if Matthew 25 is to be believed, made righteous. Therefore, the poor and the disenfranchised and the marginalized, the violently persecuted, those people on Nauru who are shaking us out of our ability just to ignore human suffering, they become the locus of our salvation. They become the locus of our revelation and our locus of our sanctification. They are the place where we meet Christ and are formed into disciples. And that changes a lot of things. How much? Let's go on the groups and find out. See you during the week, Monday to Thursday at the U-Bar, Monday and Thursday at the U-Bar, Wednesday online. Pieces.